Welcome back to the Price of Business. I'm your host, Kevin Price, talking to you about you and your business. I tell you, I saw this book, Darwin's Doubt, and if you go through our school system, and I really don't care what level, elementary all the way through graduate school, you would come to this belief that Charles Darwin had no doubt when it came to evolution. The reality is that he clearly did. He expressed that in his writing, but his students, and I use quotation marks, which are hard to convey on radio, they've read a lot more into it than what even the man who developed the theory did. And I'm so excited and been looking forward to talking to the author of this book, Darwin's Doubts, Stephen Meyer. I've read articles by him before. I've seen interviews with him before. Absolutely brilliant. He's a part of the Discovery Institute in Seattle, which George Gilder, who's been a guest on the show, is also involved with. One of my favorite think tanks, and it puts the think into think tanks. So many of these are so conventional and one-dimensional, but I think Discovery is doing some of the finest thought work out there and adding great discussion to the debate. So, Stephen, I'm delighted to have you on the program. Forgive my long introduction, but I really want the audience to appreciate what we're going to enjoy this segment.
Well, no problem, and it's great to be with you.
Yeah. So your background, I think, is absolutely fascinating. PhD from the University of Cambridge in the philosophy of science. Tell us exactly what that discipline entails. I assume it entails both work in the science fields, but as well as some of the social study fields, and particularly philosophy itself.
Well, I actually started out in geophysics, working in Dallas and Houston for one of the major oil companies back in the 80s, Atlantic Richfield, and I was doing digital signal processing at the time, which is a early form of information technology. And in the mid-'80s, a conference came to Dallas that absolutely fascinated me, in which they had scientists discussing the three big questions that intersect science and philosophy: the origin of the universe, the origin of the first life, and the origin and nature of human consciousness. And I got particularly interested in the second question, the question of the origin of life, because the scientists there were saying that essentially all the theories of what is called chemical evolution, the attempt to explain the origin of the first life from simpler non-living chemicals, had failed. All these theories had failed, and they had failed because they couldn't account for the origin of the information, the digital information that's stored in the DNA molecule. The big problem was, how do you get from chemistry to code? No one could actually figure that out. And because I was working in an information technology field, I got fascinated with the question. And a year later, I had left the oil business and was off to Cambridge and was studying this question of the origin of life, which is one of those great scientific questions that also intersects the great philosophical issues, going kind of all the way back to the Greeks. Is it a mind-first universe or a matter-first? Is it mind over matter, or does mind emerge from matter? And so those are the kind of questions that philosophers of science are interested in. They're clearly scientific questions, but they're questions that have larger implications however you answer them.
Yeah, they're scientific but also metaphysical.
Yeah, exactly. And whether you're talking about consciousness or the origin of the universe, or certainly where life came from, you're going to these questions are incorrigibly philosophical as well as scientific.
Yeah, absolutely, no question about it. And sometimes those two are uncomfortable with each other, aren't they?
Well, that's right. And if you come to certain conclusions, some scientists who are used to thinking in strictly materialistic terms about everything will say, well, that's religion. You're bringing science. You're bringing religion into science, or that's a metaphysical conclusion. But it's however you answer these questions, it's really inescapable. And an example I like to use is that really gets at this question of the origin of information is, imagine you're walking into the British Museum, and you see, as you enter, the famed Rosetta Stone. And if you're wedded to a strictly materialistic understanding of science, you're going to be forced to say, well, isn't it wonderful what wind and erosion did to create all those inscriptions on the stone? But everybody knows that's not an adequate explanation, because the inscriptions are full of information, in fact, in 3 different languages. And we know that information arises always from an intelligent source. So when we see the products of intelligence inscribed in rock, we quite correctly infer that an intelligence, a mind, not a material process, was responsible. And this is the kind of reasoning that's led me to the conclusion that what we're looking at inside living organisms, in particular, when we see these huge infusions of new information arising in the history of life, as is required to build new forms of animal life, for example, which is what my latest book is about. What we're then looking at is evidence of the activity of a designing intelligence in the history of life. You don't get information from any other source, and yet we see events in the history of life that clearly require big infusions of new information.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I love the book. The book says the evidence that Darwin could not explain, but I think obviously demands explanation, and that's what you go into. You know, I've long believed that and again, this is my opinion, and I am not a scientist, nor have I played one on TV, but I've always believed that that the idea of atheism, for example, the idea that it came from nowhere, that there is no God, to me is an intellectually dishonest way of looking at science. I think the first and second laws of thermodynamics makes the argument that there's some external force, and because of entropy, things are only going to get worse, they're going to get better. So this external force has to improve the quality of energy. I have a real liberal arts background. Both my undergraduate and graduate work were in history, and I avoided as science and math as much as I could. You don't have to be a scientist, though, to figure those two simple things out. I can understand the agnostic, but the atheist I've always had trouble with.
Well, your intuitions are really good, and information, especially digital information, that performs a function or conveys a meaning, is a specific kind of what's called negative entropy. And what we know about information from our ordinary experience, from our uniform and repeated experience, which is actually the basis of all scientific reasoning about the past, is that information always arises from an intelligent source, whether you're looking at a hieroglyphic inscription or a section of software code or a paragraph in a book or information embedded in a radio signal. Whenever we find information and we trace it back to its source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. And so the discovery that information is at the foundation of life, encoded in the DNA molecule, and that new forms of life arise because of new infusions of information, suggests again that there must be a designing intelligence at work in the history of life. We know of no other cause for that really important effect, which is foundational to life itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Darwin's Doubt is the name of the book. Stephen Meyer is the author. It's a New York Times bestseller. I'm delighted and really looking forward to having Stephen on the show. I'm looking forward to continuing our discussion right after this break here on The Price of Business.